You know, when you think about World War I, what comes to mind? Probably trenches, right? Muddy, brutal fighting in France and Belgium, and yeah, that was a huge part of it. But that's not the whole story, not even close. The war's real footprint was global, and this is the crazy part. It ended up coming back to bite the very empires that started it.
So, that brings us to this big, central question. How does a war for empire end up becoming a war against it? It seems totally backwards, right? But that's exactly what happened, and that's the paradox we're going to unpack.
All right, so let's get into it. It all starts with a pretty simple fact. The big players in Europe, Britain, France, Germany, they weren't just countries. They were massive, sprawling global empires. So when they declared war on each other, it was never going to be just a European thing. They dragged the whole world and all their colonies right into the middle of it.
And believe me, that war machine needed to be fed. It had this just insatiable appetite. To keep it running, the empires turned straight to their colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. And look, for the people living there, this wasn't a choice. It was a demand. All of a sudden, a conflict that kicked off in Sarajevo had very real, life-or-death consequences for someone in Senegal or Singapore.
So, what were they taking? What do the empires actually need? Well, it really boiled down to two main things: raw materials to build the weapons and supply the armies, and, well, the men to actually go and fight the battles.
And I mean, think about just how basic this stuff was. You can't run trucks or tanks without oil and rubber. You're not making bullets without copper and tin. And you sure can't feed millions of soldiers without tons and tons of food. Every bit of it was pulled out of colonial lands to fuel a war happening thousands of miles away.
But it wasn't just about resources. The war demanded bodies. And we're not talking about a few thousand volunteers here. We are talking about millions. Millions of men, either recruited or straight up forced into service from all over the colonies. I mean, that's just a staggering number. It completely changed the face of the world.
And this recruitment effort was just huge. It was everywhere. You had soldiers from British India, from French West Africa, from what we now call Vietnam, from the West Indies, all brought together to fight a war that, let's be honest, had nothing to do with them. It was a truly global army, built for one purpose: to serve the empire.
Now you'd think, right? You'd think that if you go and fight for the empire, maybe that earns you some respect. Maybe a path to being treated as an equal? Well, for most of these soldiers, the reality was the exact opposite. It was a brutal betrayal of any promise they might have believed in.
Just look at the difference between the promise and the reality. They were told they were fighting for freedom, but they faced constant discrimination from the white soldiers. They were promised a shot at equality, but instead, they were treated like they were disposable, given the most dangerous missions, the ones that led to unbelievably high casualty rates. They were soldiers of the empire, sure, but they were never treated as equals.
And we have to remember, this wasn't all just happening on the Western Front, not at all. There were massive campaigns all over the world. Colonial troops were absolutely essential in the Middle East, fighting the Ottoman Empire. They fought these incredibly tough battles to take over German colonies in Africa and Asia. The war completely turned those societies upside down.
Okay, so this is where the boomerang really starts to come back. Because the soldiers who managed to survive all this, they didn't come home the same people they were when they left. The war had changed them. It fundamentally and permanently altered how they saw the world and their own place in it.
It was a massive shift in thinking. I mean, think about it. First, they're fighting a war supposedly for the freedom of places like Belgium, and they start asking the obvious question, hey, what about our freedom? Second, they saw their supposedly superior European officers bleed and die just like anyone else. That whole myth of superiority shattered. So when these veterans finally got home, they started demanding those very same rights for themselves.
And this powerful new way of thinking, it has a name: colonial nationalism. It's really a simple but revolutionary idea that your home shouldn't be ruled by some distant empire, that you should govern yourselves. Now, this idea wasn't brand new, but after the war, for millions of veterans, it became real. It became urgent. It was something worth fighting for.
So you see the irony, right? The very act of using the entire empire to save itself, well, it created the perfect conditions for that empire to start falling apart. The war's biggest legacy wasn't some treaty signed in a palace in Europe. It was in the minds of the millions of soldiers who returned home.
Bottom line, World War I was the tipping point. It didn't destroy the colonial empires overnight, of course not, but it dealt them a fatal blow. It gave a whole generation of future independence leaders military training, a sharp political awareness, and a very, very powerful grudge against their rulers.
And you can see how this plays out over the next few decades. The veterans come home in 1918 with these new ideas. By the 1920s, nationalist movements are catching fire all across the colonial world. And that fire just keeps building until, after a Second World War, the whole imperial structure just starts to crumble. The seeds that were planted in the trenches of World War I, they had finally grown.
Which brings us back to one last, pretty heavy question. The Allied powers, they won. They celebrated their victory in 1918. But in winning the war for their empires, they accidentally launched a global movement against them. So you just have to ask yourself, what was the real price of that victory?